Hi everybody, and welcome to Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, we are going to explore the concept of the stakeholder method of analyzing corporate activities and behaviors. Please be sure to review the learning objectives that we will be covering in this chapter in these next couple of slides. Traditionally, we have studied business from the perspective of a three-legged stool. We have been primarily concerned with shareholder value, employee interests, and creditor issues. A more realistic view of looking at corporate activity, however, is looking at corporations and businesses from a biological or nature perspective. Business interacts with and is impacted by a number of stakeholders that may or may not be directly related to the primary economic purpose of the company, and ignoring those stakeholders can cause potential problems for the business. The general systems theory, which is the nature theory, suggests that business does not exist or operate in a vacuum. We must look at all business activities in light of a broader context. In so doing, we must first define the basic purposes of a business and then understand to whom or to what a firm is ultimately responsible to. Under the ownership theory of the firm, we are concerned primarily with the impact of business decisions on the owners or shareholders of the business. What impacts the owners is of utmost importance under this theory. The focus is on maximization of value for the owners. The focus is not on long-term sustainability for the other entity or other stakeholders. Under the stakeholder theory of the firm, different concerns are at the forefront. While stakeholder value is still important, what is also important is that we must look at the consideration of other stakeholders, because in so doing, the value for the owners of the firm will be maximized and spread out over the long run. The ownership theory focuses on one at the expense of the other. The stakeholder theory, on the other hand, attempts to balance the interests of the owners and the various stakeholders, hopefully coming up with a symbiotic, beneficial relationship for both. A stakeholder is a person or group directly or indirectly impacted by the activities of a business. In looking at stakeholders, we must distinguish between what type of stakeholder they are. We will see that there are primary, or also known as market stakeholders, and these are individuals or entities that are involved in the primary economic activities of the business. These would include people like customers, employees, suppliers, creditors, and the like. There is a second and sometimes much larger group of stakeholders known as non-market or secondary stakeholders. These are stakeholders who, while not directly involved in the primary business purpose or economic activity of the company, they are nonetheless impacted by the business's activities. Here we look at groups such as communities, the government, media, special interest groups, and the like. Some, in looking at the stakeholder relationship, also may look at internal versus external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are those who work inside the entity and contribute their efforts and skills to everyday operations. These would primarily be primary stakeholders. There are also external stakeholders who, while not involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, may have important transactions with the firm. The illustration depicted on this slide indicates more or less the complex web that business has with its various stakeholder groups. This is a relatively simplistic depiction. As we will see, there are many more complex relationships that we will study ahead. When looking at the impact of activities of a business on its environment, there are 4 questions that need to be asked, and this is called a stakeholder analysis. Who are the relevant stakeholders involved in a particular issue? What are the interests of each stakeholder in that issue? What is the power of each stakeholder? And how are coalitions between stakeholder groups likely to form over time and on particular interests? The first question to ask is to identify the stakeholders, and in so doing, one needs to differentiate initially between primary market stakeholders and secondary non-market stakeholders. What is important to realize, however, is that all stakeholder groups are potentially important. One should not go in with the assumption that a market stakeholder may somehow be more important than a non-market stakeholder, because each can have significant impacts on the company. The second question that needs to be asked in a stakeholder analysis is, what are the interests of each stakeholder in this particular interest? What are the group's concerns? What does the group want or expect from their relationship with the firm? It's important to know how an issue may impact a particular stakeholder group at a given point in time. The third question that needs to be asked in each stakeholder analysis is, what power does each have to enforce their power or their interest? And this can be important and sometimes can be difficult to ascertain. For example, what power does an employee have to enforce its interest in getting wages and job security? Perhaps there's unionization. Perhaps there's nothing. What power does a special interest group have to make sure that a company is doing things that it views as beneficial to the community? Again, it may have resources in which to launch a media campaign, it may not. But it's important to look at each power group that a potential stakeholder has, and generally we see that there are these 5 stakeholder power groups that exist. There's voting power, and that can be political voting power, it can be corporate voting power. Economic power, casting dollar votes. Political power, legal power to enforce rights within the court, and then informational power. This is where community interest groups and the media can be particularly persuasive. The last question to ask is, are there likely groups of stakeholders that may form coalitions that could cause problems to particular entities? For example, one disgruntled customer who is unhappy with a product or who a product hurt or injured by his or herself may not be very powerful. However, if they can get CNN or some other media source to cover their story, then suddenly that coalition between that individual stakeholder and the media creates a whole world of headaches for the company. In doing stakeholder analysis, you can create a visual depiction of stakeholder issues or potential stakeholder issues through stakeholder salience and mapping. When we look at the issue of stakeholder salience, we are looking to see what particular stakeholders might be most impacted and might have the most power to do something about a particular corporate issue. This mapping needs to be done on every issue because there will be different stakeholders with different salience levels each and every time. In the case of doing stakeholder salience and stakeholder mapping, a high salience level on the part of a stakeholder means that the business entity should particularly reach out to that stakeholder and address that issue. This slide depicts the visible stakeholder salience that has been laid out on this particular grid. And again, you'll be able to see what a stakeholder's position is on a particular issue and what their level of interest in. And again, the higher the level of interest, the more engaging the corporation might want to be with that particular stakeholder group. The business entity should be proactive, and we will talk about this more in later chapters, but the corporation or the business entity should be well aware of the natural environment, the stakeholders that exist in that natural environment, and different issues and problems that those stakeholders might be having. This slide shows a depiction of the corporation and the different stakeholder groups that it could be involved with, and how the corporation really needs to be aware of each and everything that's going on in each of those particular groups, and more importantly, the idea that stakeholders can reach out across those different slices of the pie and create new and unanticipated issues for the corporation. The external environment in which a business does business is constantly changing. The business entity should be aware of the following functions that will impact it. And we'll look at each of these functions of society and these issues of society in subsequent lectures. First, there's changing societal expectations. What does society expect a corporation to be, and how a corporation should act? Next, there is a growing importance of ethical expectations on business. While many stakeholders may not know exactly how to define ethics in relation to a particular issue, there is an underlying understanding that business needs to be ethical and business will be punished if it is not. The third factor is the impact of globalization on stakeholders. As we will see, globalization has been a relatively high disruptive force on business and its impact with its stakeholders. Fourth is changing regulatory environment and the business's response to that. Fifth is the changing natural environment. We'll be looking at issues of climate change and the like, and how is business to respond to that. And then last, the impact of technology on business and society. We will see that legal response, business response, and societal response is oftentimes slow to catch up to the issues that new technology presents to us on a daily basis. And finally, this last slide is a graphical depiction of the forces impacting business and its stakeholders, and we will be spending time talking about each of those in detail. Well, that's everything for Chapter 1. We'll visit with you again in Chapter 2. Have a nice day.